Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a parable that Jesus told, sometimes called the parable of the oil lamps, other times called the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Before we dive into this, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 1 through to 13. We're continuing our journey through the early parts of Holy Week, but the story skips ahead a little bit from where we left it last time. We find Jesus now having left the temple complex following a series of disputations with representatives from various of the lively groups within the Judaism of the day. All of that covers chapter 21 verse 23 through to chapter 23 verse 39. We learned early on in chapter 24 that Jesus had left the temple and was now on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. That's where the action in today's reading takes place. The focus in chapters 24 and 25 is partly on end times, as Matthew 25 follows on from some of the multiple eschatological warnings in Matthew 24. But it's also about a challenge for the people of Israel to be ready for signs of the kingdom of God breaking in the here and now. Today's parable is the first of a set of 3 extended parables in this chapter. In verses 14 to 30, we've got what could become known as the parable of the talents. And in verses 31 to 46, we've got what's become known as the parable of the sheep and the goats. And this section, including maybe chapter 23 as well, according to some scholars, but certainly chapters 24 and 25, forms the final one of the 5 blocks of Jesus' teaching that Matthew gathers together in this gospel, curates as it were. And these 5 blocks of teaching are thought to mirror the 5 books of the Torah, of the law of Moses. So in this passage, we've got Jesus coming to the end, not just of his public ministry, but of his earthly life. And it seems to me that he's getting ready to hand on the baton to his disciples. He's getting them ready for the task ahead of them. This group of disciples includes, but is not limited to, the 12 who formed Jesus' inner circle. And I say they're being prepared to take on the work that Jesus himself has begun. They are the people who will be at the heart of the life of the church following the resurrection. Now we know that Matthew's Gospel was the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, probably around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. It's the most overtly grounded of the 4 Gospels in what we now call Second Temple Judaism. And that's important because the temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, and that had a massive effect on the sense of identity of God's people, Israel. And I think some of that feeds through into today's passage with its challenge to be prepared for the full implications of what Jesus' coming means. Now, as is typical, there are other texts that we might wish to look at if we want to make full sense of what's before us. So we might want to spend some time in the book of Proverbs, and in particular looking at chapters 1 through to 9, in which time and again we find a contrast made between the mythical figures of Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly. And it's arguably the case that those two figures, Lady Wisdom, Dame Folly, are mirrored in the group of bridesmaids who were ready to go and those who were not, as it were. We may want to look at, for example, Isaiah chapter 54 verse 5 or Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 32, because both of these texts depict Yahweh as the bridegroom of Israel, which I think is important in terms of the interpretation of Jesus' parable. And finally, we might recall another story Jesus told back in Matthew chapter 7 verses 24 through to 27, part of the Sermon on the Mount, where there's a contrast between the wise builder who built their house upon the rock and the foolish builder who built their house upon the sand. That same imagery seems to be evoked in today's story. Now we know, if we step back a little bit into Matthew 24 verses 37 through to 51, that Matthew was very much drawing upon material found in Mark's Gospel. But this parable is the first major piece of Matthew's own, what we might call, supplementary material. Now, if we're going to make sense of it, we need to understand a little bit about how marriage worked in first century Judaism. The culture was very different from what we find today. For starters, marriage was a two-stage process. You'd have a year-long betrothal before the actual marriage took place. And it was a legally binding betrothal, unlike engagements nowadays, which can very easily be broken if needed. During that year, the bride would continue to live in her father's household. And it was only on the wedding day that the groom would escort the bride from her father's house to his parents' house. And that's where the wedding feast would take place. And so what we now call the bridesmaids would actually have been friends of the groom rather than of the bride, as in today's culture. And their job was to light the way for the bride and groom as they made this journey using their oil lamps. And it was not unusual for delays to be possible. We're talking about a very patriarchal society where marriage was a real negotiation between two families, and in particular the father of the bride and the groom, and perhaps even the groom's parents. So it wasn't unusual for there to be sort of last-minute negotiations in this contract, and therefore the maids, the bridesmaids for want of a better word, would not have necessarily known at what point the groom would be ready to set off on this journey with his new bride. Now, I've talked a little bit about passages already that refer to Yahweh, the God of Israel, as the bridegroom. Most commentators take the bride here, bridegroom rather, I said, to be a representation of Jesus. And so this parable has often been read in terms of the coming of the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel, the Anointed One, who would bring renewal to God's people. And it seems that this identification has roots in Jesus' own teaching, for example, in chapter 9, verse 15. And as I say, it reflects a title that was normally used for God. So there's an identification here of God with Jesus. His divine status is evident if we're interpreting this parable correctly. Now, it's true that in another parable we've looked at, the parable where a servant is dragged in off the street to come to a wedding feast, doesn't have the appropriate wedding clothes and is turfed out into the outer darkness, that which we found in chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, can be read as casting Jesus also as the bridegroom there, but is probably best interpreted, more persuasively interpreted, by looking at it in a different way. I think the story we have before us today in chapter 25 is much more straightforward to grapple with. The young woman, and the Greek word parthamos means a young woman of marriageable age, these young women represent the people of Israel. The wise, in this interpretation, do recognise that Jesus is the Messiah. The foolish are the ones who reject him. The wedding party picks up on this idea of the kingdom of God as involving a heavenly banquet, a heavenly feast. But it represents, as well as having this eschatological significance, looking towards the life of the new creation, a challenge also to the Israel of the present day. Would they be ready to receive Jesus as the Messiah right now? That was the key question. Now, some have argued that the oil in this story also has particular symbolic significance, along with the bridegroom and the bridesmaids. But I'm not so convinced about that. Some scholars have argued, for example, drawing on imagery from the Sermon on the Mount, that the oil represents good deeds. And that's why we find what we do in verses 8 to 9, that this cannot be shared out, as it were. Now, we know that obviously there wouldn't have been enough oil to go around if it was shared. And given the first part of verse 10 tells us that the bridesmaids who are seeking some additional oil do so after midnight, quite clearly there wouldn't have been any oil stores open to go and buy some from. This reference to the oil as representing good deeds draws on Matthew 5 verses 14 to 16, this idea that that's what they represent and that's why it couldn't be shared out aside from the mechanics of the story. But I think, along with Tom Wright and others, that this is trying to read too much into the significance of things. I think we can take this at face value. The issue here is not being ready for the coming of the Messiah. As we learn in the latter part of verse 10, not having any oil for their lamps meant that the foolish bridesmaids could not fulfill their ceremonial role in things, and so they were refused entry to the wedding feast. It could well be, in verse 12, that the groom genuinely did not recognise them because they hadn't come prepared like those others who had been admitted to the wedding feast. Their plea in verse 11 echoes the sort of false discipleship that Jesus references in chapter 7 verses 21 and 22, where he says, "Not everybody who says, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, it might appear at face value that there is a contradiction here. We heard back in verse 5 that all of the bridesmaids fell asleep, and this might not tally with Jesus' teaching at the end of this section in verse 13 about staying awake. But I think it actually serves to highlight the key point of the parable. You see, it's not that the wise bridesmaids manage to keep themselves awake and the foolish ones fall asleep. They all fall asleep. Rather, the wise bridesmaids in this parable were ready to go, ready to fulfill their role, ready to welcome the coming Messiah, whereas the foolish bridesmaids were not prepared, not ready, not equipped for their role. They were not ready and able and willing to welcome the Messiah, as signified by the arrival of the bridegroom. And so I think the point of this parable, in which it is tempting to perhaps read a little too much symbolic significance at points, is fundamentally about readiness. Are we ready for the coming of Jesus as the Messiah? We're looking at this as a reading for early November, but we could well, perfectly reasonably, I think, have this as an Advent text if we wanted to. Are we ready for the coming of the one who changes everything and can change us if we're ready and open and willing to be changed? Of course, it's true that this parable, as I've hinted, does contain some really patriarchal assumptions. And these things would have been taken as read in the culture of Jesus' day. Do we maybe find that they make this parable too difficult for us to grapple with? We now turn to this and other questions as we engage with our questions for this week.